Okay, you're not required to watch this little talk, and you will not be tested on it. So why then would you want to watch it? Well, first, I should note that here I am outside. It's a beautiful day in Santa Barbara here. And gee, what a good day to take up the climate crisis. So, the documentaries that we will be watching in this class can be a little disturbing. The one that we're watching this week in particular, Fire in Paradise, is especially unnerving. This is why I put a trigger warning in for it. Sometimes, the more you know about the climate crisis, the more overwhelming it can seem. So, in this little talk, I just wanted to take a few minutes to underscore not only that I believe that we can get through this, the climate crisis, but also to outline how we can go about doing just that. Approached another way, people often ask me what they can do to help mitigate the climate crisis. I usually suggest a range of things. And these can be things like changing how we eat by switching to a largely plant-based diet, how we get around, forgoing cars, reevaluating our relationship to stuff like personal devices and fashion. And the documentaries that we'll be watching take up many of these issues. However, you might rightly wonder if lifestyle changes like switching to a largely plant-based diet are enough. If so, you're not alone, as a number of people have argued that such actions will prove inadequate to mitigating the climate crisis. For example, climate activist Naomi Klein has suggested that, quote, focusing on individual consumer behavior, whether it's changing light bulbs or going vegan, is just not going to get us there. Similarly, climate scientist Michael Mann has argued that focusing on, quote, beef consumption highlights the risk of losing sight of the gorilla in the room, civilization's reliance on fossil fuels for energy and transport, which accounts for roughly 2/3 of global carbon emissions. In fact, both Klein and Mann are right. Even if, for example, everyone on the planet went vegan, it would not, as Klein notes, be enough. And I would argue not enough by a long shot. But let me be clear here. I am sympathetic, as I was up until recently a hardcore vegan for 5 years, and I still eat a largely plant-based diet and absolutely, positively recommend it. But it's worth pausing to consider just how much can be done through personal action alone. Yes, if everyone on the planet gave up eating animal products, it would significantly reduce global methane emissions, and which is the main problem here, as agriculture is responsible for roughly 1/3 of global methane emissions, and methane is, depending on how you calculate it, 20 or 30 times worse than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. However, we need to accept the sobering fact that a broad swath of human beings are not going to significantly forgo eating meat voluntarily. Moreover, even though we can indeed reduce global methane emissions through our diets, more methane is generated by fossil fuel extraction, principally from hydraulic fracturing, aka fracking, than comes from all the cows on the planet. We cannot, practically speaking, end fracking through personal action. True, we could all forgo the products of fracking, petroleum, gas, and oil, but without practical and affordable alternatives, and by that I mean alternative, renewable energy, how exactly would we live, as quite a bit of our modern lives are fueled by gas and oil? Hence, unlike the situation with food, we cannot easily make a personal switch here. While we could all install solar panels on our roofs, a good idea, this would not address the fact that fracked oil and gas would still be used to make a good deal of the rest of our lives possible, such as energy used to make our clothes, our stuff, and so forth. Moreover, just as with the switch to largely plant-based diets, many, probably most people, will not likely voluntarily install solar panels on their roofs and become their own electricity providers. So with respect to methane, this is the sobering situation. Right now, only a small percentage of Americans eat with the climate in mind, and fracking, the bigger methane problem, is definitely on the rise, as half of the oil and 2/3 of the gas produced by the U.S. is now fracked. You can see why Klein and Mann want to shift focus away from personal action like eating a largely plant-based diet. But staying with this example, how then do we stop fracking? Well, it's simple enough. We need to vote and become politically active, calling for legislative changes to end fracking. However, even voting is not enough, as someone needs to bring this issue to the attention of politicians and the public. Indeed, someone needs to make it a thorn in the side of politicians. and are activists, climate activists. For example, in 2016, actor and climate activist Mark Ruffalo produced a short documentary called Dear Governor Brown that urged the former governor of California to ban fracking, which incidentally he refused to do in spite of Brown's commitment to mitigating the climate crisis. Anyhow, you do not, of course, need to be a famous actor to be a climate activist. After all, Greta Thunberg was, just a short time ago, in many ways a pretty average high school student, though in other ways an altogether extraordinary one with the ability to see the climate crisis as a black and white issue and sustain a laser-like focus on the problem. So, should we forgo personal actions like eating a plant-based diet and ditching our cars and instead work at being climate activists and getting the vote out? First, I absolutely endorse climate activism. In fact, I think of myself not just as a professor, but as first and foremost a scholar activist, a climate activist. Second, as I never tire of telling people, if you can do only one thing to help mitigate the climate crisis and you do not have a lot of time to devote to the issue, well, you're in luck, as the single most important thing that you can do takes just an hour or two per year. Who doesn't have an hour or two per year to save the climate? Than the planet. So what sort of magical action has this power? Well, it's actually a pretty pedestrian act that many people take for granted, though they absolutely shouldn't, and that's voting. So yes, in part the reason I made this little talk is to encourage you to vote. Yes, but how do you vote on behalf of the planet, its climate, and all the life that lives on it? Well, cast your vote for candidates from local to federal advocating for sweeping climate policies such as carbon pricing. In general, and here I'll tell you exactly how you should vote. Vote for candidates and initiatives to put people on the planet ahead of corporate interests. And if you have a little more time, explain to 5 or more of your friends and family the importance of voting. But what personal actions like foregoing beef, air conditioning, and travel, what about them? Travel by car. Isn't doing personal action like this important? I would argue that it's absolutely important. Moreover, I'm of the conviction that activism, voting, and personal action can, and very often are, intimately related. So let's take one of my favorite examples that I never tire of talking about, which is car use. As climate scientist Michael Mann noted with respect to the climate change, the 800-pound gorilla in the room is our, quote, civilization's reliance on fossil fuels for energy and transport overall, which accounts for roughly 2/3 of global carbon emissions. And the average American's car, incidentally, accounts for about 1/4 of our personal carbon footprints. So, okay, let's assume that we decide to forego owning a car. What then? In other words, how do you get around? Let's say you use a bicycle. Well, if your city is anything like mine, the bike infrastructure there probably leaves a lot to be desired. In fact, it may well be dangerous, even deadly. So I live in downtown Santa Barbara, 10 miles from UCSB, which is a 20-mile round trip to commute. It may sound impractical to commute that much on a bike. However, I have a pedelec bike, which is a hybrid bike with a propulsion system that is conceptually not unlike a hybrid car, except instead of being powered by an electric motor and a gasoline engine like a hybrid car, it is powered by an electric motor and my pedaling. Incidentally, a pedelec may sound like a really new technology. However, back when I was 16 years old, way back in 1976, I converted my first adult bike to a pedelec using a commercially available kit. Back when the first energy crisis happened in 1973, quite a few people were experimenting with alternative transportation, including electric-assisted bicycles. Mine had a range of about 25 miles and a top speed of about 25 miles per hour. It was surprisingly practical and could certainly have been used for my daily commute now. However, at the time, as I recall, I got laughed at quite a bit while riding it, especially to and from high school. Well, that was a different era. In any event, since my current electric bike can travel 28 miles per hour, which is the California speed limit for such a bike, and I don't even have to break a sweat, it's actually a very viable transportation alternative that can often compete with car use. But there's a problem. There are only 2 main roads that lead from my house to my office at UCSB. The first is a bike lane along the busiest street in town, that's State Street. And when I say bike lane, I really just mean that you are riding along the shoulder of the road separated from traffic by a white line, and that's it. The second route, which is Modoc Street, which is usually the one I take, is more direct with less traffic. However, it too means that I'm riding on an unprotected shoulder. What's worse, in places there, traffic is moving at 50 miles an hour and more right alongside me. Given this situation, it's perhaps not surprising, though still altogether mortifying, that 4 bicyclists have been killed along Modoc Street in the past few decades, including someone 2 years ago. So, even though I can make a commitment to personal action, ditching a car for an e-bike, the world is certainly not set up for an e-bike, like mine. It wasn't 40 years ago when I had my first one. It still isn't today. Not to put too fine an edge on it, but it's not only difficult, it can be downright deadly. Sadly, in the U.S., not much has changed in this regard in my lifetime. So what's to be done? The obvious action is to become an activist, in this case a bicycle climate activist. I would not at all be surprised if you are now, scoffing at this idea. After all, am I really suggesting that advocating for bicycle lanes can play a serious role in mitigating the climate crisis? In fact, I am. So let's look at an example where such bicycle activism made a huge difference, and that's Copenhagen. An astonishing 62%, that's nearly 2 out of 3 people, commute to work or school by bike in Copenhagen. 2 out of 3 people use a bicycle as their primary means of commuting. You might be under the impression that bicycle culture goes back many decades to the beginning of the 20th century when cars first came on the scene in Denmark. In fact, it's a relatively recent and profound cultural change. I offer it as an example as it proves that extraordinary cultural change of just the kind that we need to combat the climate crisis can indeed happen. So allow me to quote from Wikipedia, which concisely lays out the history of bicycling in Copenhagen. Note that it begins back in the early 1970s, 1973 to be exact, with the first energy crisis that alerted much of the world that we needed to quickly wean ourselves off of fossil fuels. And the Copenhagen's remarkable transformation into a bicycle culture was largely a bottom-up phenomenon brought about by bicycle/environmental activists. So when the energy crisis, which hit Denmark harder than most countries, and this is reading from Wikipedia here, and the growing environmental movement in the 1970s, cycling experienced a renaissance. The government was forced to introduce car-free Sundays to conserve oil reserves. Many city dwellers thought it was the best day of the week, and the Danish Cyclist Federation organized massive demonstrations in Copenhagen and other cities demanding better infrastructure and safety for city cyclists. Another grassroots action cited for helping bring about the infrastructure and change in political action was Operation White Crosses, where white crosses were painted on the streets where a cyclist had been killed in traffic. Although the first separate cycle tracks were constructed much earlier, they did not become the norm until the 1980s. Politicians, although not very eager, gradually took up bicycle tracks on main roads and also began developing its first concerted efforts for increasing cycling in the municipality. The LA Times, by the way, nicely continues this history into the 21st century by noting that, quote, in recent years, cycling has enjoyed yet another surge in popularity in Copenhagen. This is the result of consistently improving bike lanes coupled with fears of climate change. Global warming presents an existential threat to this Baltic seaport, which lies just a few feet above sea level. So, what would the impact be if the same number of Americans swapped their cars for bikes? Well, let's do a quick back-of-the-napkin calculation. 62% of the population of Copenhagen times 4.6 metric tons of CO2 per year, which is the U.S. average, equals a reduction of 3.8 billion pounds of CO2 emissions per year. That's 3.8 billion pounds with a B, and that's just in one relatively small city. Imagine the impact if this happened in cities across the U.S. and world. Could be objected that bicycle commuting is not practical in many American locales as it gets pretty cold in the U.S. However, it also gets cold in Copenhagen as it's further north than any of the lower 48 states. In fact, it's far closer in latitude to Juneau, Alaska than to the rest of the U.S. Note that what happened in Copenhagen happened on a local level, with activists forcing the city's local politicians to act. When the election time comes around, we might assume that the climate crisis is a national issue, which it certainly is. However, it's also the truth that what happens on your local town, as with the example of Copenhagen, can have global consequences. Similarly, the reason that climate activists like Mark Ruffalo pressured the governor of California because he had the ability to stop fracking on a state level. Hence, state, local, and national elections all play major roles in mitigating the climate crisis, or at least can. Again, the local city elections in Copenhagen have been responsible for keeping the equivalent of 3.8 pounds of CO2 or equivalent gases being released if it were in the U.S. And of course, this all started with environmental activists. When it comes to making a difference in the climate crisis, it is not a question of choosing either personal action or climate activism or becoming politically active. In many, many cases, as in the example of Copenhagen, all three are interrelated connected. I would argue that personal action does have a special position as it can keep our focus on the prize on a daily basis. Every day that we hop on a bike or forgo a burger, we remind ourselves that much needs to be done and that we are, even in a small way, doing something. Doing such small things also sends a message to the rest of the world as we lead by way of example. To echo a phrase attributed to Gandhi, we need to indeed become the change that we want to see in the world. However, as I noted above, the most important single thing that you can do about the climate crisis is to vote. So yes, I'm encouraging you to vote. Seriously. We can do a lot from the bottom up, but we need top-down action as well. And the number two most important thing is to try to convince friends and family to vote on behalf of the planet as well. Family can be especially important. Why? Well, for a while now, we've been trying to figure out which messengers are most effective in communicating the urgency of the climate crisis to skeptics in particular. It's clear that activists like Al Gore are not very effective, as skeptics tend to dismiss these messengers before they've even opened their mouths. Alternately, people who are not activists, like the current Pope Francis, are actually more effective communicators, as skeptics do not tend to attribute bias to them in this regard. However, a 2019 poll in the journal Nature, and it's actually a study, identified the most important agents of change when it comes to the climate crisis. Who are they? Children, even those as young as 10 years old. So how is this possible? Because their skeptical parents are more likely to listen to them, more than to Al Gore, more than the Pope, more than anyone else, especially when they're expressing their anxieties about the future. Incidentally, and I am not sure researchers quite know why, but even though parents generally listen to their children, in a general way in this regard, they are most likely to listen to their daughters. I don't know why. The thing is, every parent wants a bright future for their children. And when seeing, how this could potentially be threatened by climate change, they often start listening. Even if they are not fully convinced about the climate crisis, they may not be willing to gamble their children's future if they think they might even be a long shot that the climate crisis is true. As Bob Inglis, who's actually a Republican politician from South Carolina, noted in response to the fact that 97 or 98% of scientists believe that the climate crisis is real and is being caused by human beings. He said, if you had a sick child that you took to 100 doctors for evaluation and 90 came up with the same diagnosis, would you go with the opinion of the other two if your child's health and future was hanging in the balance? Anyhow, I'm curious to hear what you think about the roles that personal action, activism, being politically active should play in the climate crisis. So I'm going to open these comments up on YouTube. And regarding this being, really about, getting you to think about action, activism, and voting, I'll leave you with one last thought. You have until October 19th to register to vote for the upcoming election. Okay, well, thanks and take care.